Jens was furious. I sat down with him. He said, Skip, I just don't get it. It's so frustrating, so confusing. How could they possibly think that I'm rude? So it was very frustrating for him to be seen as rude. But after half an hour, for me, it was pretty clear in the words he used, his intonation, his way of interacting with me, there was something missing in his mastery of English. So I said to Jens, one of the explanations could easily be something I've noticed a lot about Danish leaders, and that is they speak the language really well. Danes are known as some of the best speakers of English among non-English speakers. They're really good, they sound good. In particular, it sounds proficient, it sounds like mastery. So when you sound really proficient in English or in any other language, people judge you as meaning everything you say, and when they feel something, in other words, if they feel like that you are rude or impolite or you implied something in the language, they assume you mean it. Jens was sarcastic. It's a national sport. They're world champions in Denmark in sarcasm. And it's got a lot of social functions. Now, the problem when we go into using it in English is that it's very hard to determine the impact. Now, when you manage in Danish, you can sort of more or less, because you've been practicing for 30 years, get the impact right. But when you move into English, say speaking to an English person or to somebody who uses English as a second language, we have a huge amount of problem here. Because sarcasm hides or is the opposite of what I mean. Now, if as a leader your job is to create clear communication, direction, and confidence, sarcasm is absolutely going to undermine those three things immediately. One of the characteristics about a lot of Danish leaders is they don't like to express too much ambition because they don't like to disappoint. So the idea of saying, we're going to go to Mars to start a colony there, is just way beyond how a Danish sort of leader would approach it. And yet it's super important to engage and motivate, particularly outside of Denmark. Let me explain. I use a simple example. The Americans want to go to Mars because they've been to the moon and they have to always kind of set that next level. The Chinese and the Indians, they all want to go to the moon because they want to prove they're as good as the Americans. The Danes want to be 100% fossil fuel free. And that really sums up the huge difference in ambition between those kinds of countries. In Denmark, if you talk too ambitiously or boldly about the future, you're going to meet lots of sarcasm and irony and people who are going to say, can't be done, you don't know what you're talking about, what a dreamer. When you take a Danish accent into English, it sounds American almost automatically, because it's similar to the American pattern, or certainly some of the American accents, right? Unfortunately, it comes across as fairly dispassionate. It's not overly engaged. It sounds a little robotic when you have an intonation pattern like this. It sounds competent, but not very charismatic. So for Jens, it was about learning to use his intonation differently, learning to use pauses, learning to use grammar. In other words, to speak quickly and then slower to highlight his points, or to go up in volume and go down in volume. These kinds of tips enable him to be much more expressive without necessarily expecting him to sort of like completely change who he was. So that started a conversation with Jens about how we could manage this impact through English. In other words, learn to use different words, learn to use a different intonation, learn to check for understanding, learn to manage some of the social scenarios, things as simple as serving cakes to your team, simple social scenarios where he needed to take the lead or follow in a different way in English. I wrote an article recently which got very popular on LinkedIn, where I spoke about Danish children being taught to participate rather than to lead. And this created somewhat of a stir amongst a lot of Danish people. So let me explain my point. Danish culture, children are taught to participate in the classroom, to use their teacher's first name, to speak up, to listen to each other, to participate. Now, in Australian schools, or in America or in England, they're taught to lead, which is very different. In other words, there are leadership programs in schools. Now, what that means when Danish people have to lead, particularly outside of Denmark, where participation is not taught, they have to lead with a big L. Unfortunately, Danish leaders have a tendency to interpret the actions of non-Danes as being, unparticipative, not speaking up. Because Danish leaders have an expectation that you're going to say something, that you're going to participate, that you're going to show initiative, you're going to do all those things. A Danish leader can more or less take a much more little L form of leadership, and people will like that because they will participate more naturally in that style. The simple explanation is that Danish speakers of English are the best in the world. So people have very high expectations. So if I'm expecting that you mean everything you say, and you say something that with your flat intonation, or use a word that maybe is a bit impolite, or you don't say please, or you don't say thank you, I'm going to start thinking you actually meant to be insulting. You actually meant to, show that you don't value our relationship. Now, if we add a bit of sarcasm, if we add a flat, pattern, if we add maybe not using exactly the precise word, it's very likely that you're going to be seen as rude.